So, when it comes to advice, I think there's pretty much two ways it can happen. The first off is, I call it the tell me what to do way, right? Which is recipes for success. And I get it, we're all under stress to deliver. And a lot of times we just want someone to tell us, look, just tell me what to do. But there's another way of thinking about advice. And I think about it as the via negativa approach, which is instead of internalizing all the countless things that I should be doing, think about the few things that I definitely should not be doing. And there's two reasons for that. I think one, first off, is what worked for some other company or some other team may not exactly work for you. And the second thing, which is probably the main reason, is that a string of really good decisions can be completely destroyed by one bad decision. So that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about two bad habits or diseases or biases that can really just blow up your growth and innovation efforts. So without further ado, first one, focusing on outcomes instead of environments. Illustrate what I mean by that. I'll use the Brexit example. All right, so I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Brexit. In 2016, the UK government held this referendum where they offered voters two outcomes. Right? Do you want to stay in the EU or do you want to leave the EU? And I'm also sure you're probably aware of what happened. Right? 49% voted for the outcome stay and 51% voted for leave. However, does this really describe what these voters wanted? Right? In particular, the people who wanted to leave. Well, luckily, people did do some research at the time. So people who voted, yes, I want to leave the EU, well, they asked them, well, why? Like, why did you vote for this? And basically, two reasons were most often given. The first was, they said, well, decisions about the UK should be taken in the UK. All right. And the second one is they believe that, well, we want to make sure that the UK has control over immigration and its own borders. Now, here's the kicker, right? Did the UK have to leave the EU to realize these goals? Suppose we went back in time and the government thought, okay, we have a whole bunch of our voters clamoring, like, we don't like the EU, we don't want to be part of this anymore, we want to leave. Instead of just a knee-jerk reaction, okay, fine, you want that outcome, vote, and then let's see what happens. Instead, if they dug a little deeper and like, okay, well, what's really driving you to pursue this? And they would have found out, I believe they would have found these out, and then they could have had the option, okay, well, maybe we could have pursued a different outcome. Instead of leave the EU, maybe we could have gone to the EU and asked for some policy changes or renegotiate our membership, or maybe some other things that I'm not aware of. And I think if they had gone that route, we'd be in a much better place than we are now. So, what happened there? Well, I think that conversation moved from thinking about what are called outcome goals to something else called environmental goals. And I'll describe the difference between the two. So, outcome goals. First off, they have these two important characteristics. First off, think of it as it's an output of a specific interaction, right? So, on Tuesday, voters show up and they interact with the vote, and they choose, okay, leave or stay, and that's in the outcome is the result of all those happening together. The other important thing about outcomes is that they're clearly defined start and end, meaning that the vote really didn't matter on Monday. They were anticipating it, but the vote didn't really matter on that day. It mattered a whole lot on that one day, but then afterwards, it didn't really matter so much because they already made the decision, they realized that outcome, and now they have to figure out, okay, what are we going to do next? How are we going to actually deliver this? And now they're pursuing other outcomes, like create a withdrawal plan, for example. But does that really describe these other goals? right? And I'm going to suggest that actually these are different types of goals. And I think of these as environmental goals. So, characteristics of environmental goals. First off, they describe an attribute of a state, right? So, this is important. So, when consumers are pursuing an environmental goal, it's persistent, right? It's not like on Monday I care about immigration, Tuesday I don't, and then Wednesday I do again, and then maybe later on the week I don't. It's a state that I want to achieve and then sustain. And then, of course, because of that, there's no defined start and end. As long as the goal is important to me, I want it to be fulfilled and maintained. Okay, so much for all the kind of theory and technical part of this. I'll give you a specific example. So here, about 2 years ago, my research company, we were brought in to help Arlo grow, right? So typical growth story. And they brought us in, and again, they said, "Hey, Al, we're number one in the market. We're selling, but new entrants are coming in. We want to defend our territory, but of course, we want to achieve growth. How can we do this?" And so our team came in, and we thought, okay, I know you want us to focus on the camera and help you achieve growth with that, but let's just stand back a little bit. Let's investigate. When people are getting the Arlo camera, what type of environment are they trying to create and sustain for themselves? So long story short, we came up with numerous environments, but for this talk, I'll just focus on two. So the first one is, we call it protect and defend. So some of the environmental goals of that are things like, I work with my neighbors to fight crime, criminals don't see my house as a target. Again, things that matter always. Right? It's not like on Monday, I'm concerned about criminals seeing my house as a target, and then on Tuesday they don't. It's like, no, as long as I'm consuming the product, this goal is important to me, and it has to be maintained. So this was helpful to the team, but not terribly new. However, what was better was this care and aware job, right? And this was actually very different, right? This was things like, I want to keep an eye on my kids. I want to always know about if there's any problems with the heat or water problems, or things like, I want my home to always, when I come home after a long day, I want to be welcomed. It's kind of the experience I want to have. So with this new thinking, right, the team was able to, and this is just a few, was able to brainstorm a whole lot of different types of products and services, right, beyond just the camera. Because now they thought, okay, how can we create a system of products that work together to enable, to create and maintain this particular environment for consumers. And so we have things that range all the way from the Arlo Mentor multi-sensor, which is things like, people can use that for CO2 problems, air quality, temperature. People were concerned like, well, what if someone leaves a window open and the AC is on? How can I just make sure I'm not wasting energy and so on and so forth. And of course, they moved beyond cameras to even audio, right? They have a siren they made, and also lights, so like strobe lights, to kind of reinforce that protect and defend job. But then also, again, when they're thinking about, okay, well, how can I help? I want this goal around my home welcoming me when I arrive. And so they came up with this Arlo remote here, which is great. So it serves two functions. When I'm arriving at home, I can kind of hit a certain sequence and certain things can happen. Or with some geofencing, just because I have the keychain with me, the home will sense me arriving, and then it'll operate some sort of predefined sequence. The driveway will light up, and lights will turn on, and so I feel like I'm getting welcomed home. And I want that always to happen. So I'll sum up this point here. So some quick do's and don'ts. First, don't think of outcomes as what consumers want. Now, again, I'm talking about growth and innovation. If you want to go down the quality route, that's a little different. But I'm just thinking about for completely new things. Avoid thinking about it, framing goals as outcomes. Instead, think about it as environments that they want to create and sustain for themselves. And next, don't study consumers in their current environments only. Instead, Study what environments consumers aspire to create and maintain. Again, this is about growth, right? If I study consumers in the environments that they are today, that's going to help me improve their environments of today. But what about the environments that they want to create for tomorrow, or those that get them excited? That's creating new environments is why people buy new products. I don't suddenly buy a whole suite of home security options because I want things to be the same thing that they've been in the past. It's because I want things to be different. And last, don't think about, study the intermediary goals associated with product use. Again, if you want to go, improve usability, right, customer satisfaction, great, go down that route. However, again, for growth and really innovation efforts, think about the change that consumers want to make in their lives and find out what kind of change gets them excited about adopting a new product or service. All right, second one, right, which is going to be pretty fun. Focusing on problems instead of solutions. Now, to be clear, yes, I'm saying that it can be a mistake to be focusing on problems, and instead you should focus on solutions. To explain what I mean, I'm going to talk about the history of bicycles in the Netherlands. So in the early 20th century, the Netherlands, per capita, had the highest ownership of bicycles. So they loved their bicycles in the early 20th century, like 1920s, that time. However, World War II came around, and I think this is Rotterdam, I think, after the Luftwaffe bombed it. So they, like a lot of other countries in Europe, experienced a lot of damage. So they had the opportunity to change some of their urban planning. And so this is the late 40s, and so they're thinking, okay, well, cars are this new thing now, right? People, it's much more affordable. Back in the 1920s and early 20th century, cars were kind of a novelty. So it's kind of fun, it's off to the side. But cars are actually more accessible. So let's add some roads in and some parking lots. And so if someone wants to get a car, they can do that. So what happened? Well, it was very successful. In fact, it was so successful, it started causing traffic problems. And people were complaining about a lack of parking and, of course, traffic in the street. And so here's an example. I don't know what city this is, but an example of here, you can see the traffic building up and, of course, the conflict this is creating with pedestrians and people on bicycles. So what did they do? Well, they popped on their problem-solving hat. How can we solve this problem? And so they thought, okay, well, we have all these old buildings, right? So let's knock down some of these old buildings and old neighborhoods, and let's make, of course, more roads and more parking, right? That's how we'll solve the problem. If there's a problem with traffic, how do you solve the traffic problem? Well, you solve it with more roads, right? So that's exactly what they did. They knocked down these older neighborhoods, which no one, sparsely populated. It's after the war, there still were buildings, so that's fine. We'll let it go. So results, it worked. It was great. So now traffic is relieved. But then, a few years later, 5 or 10 years later, another problem arises. See, now that the country is recovering after the war, the population is recovering, now there's a housing problem. Because if you remember, they knocked down all those houses from before. So, where are these people going to live? So I thought, okay, how can we solve this problem of housing? What are we going to do? So they thought, okay, hey, we just built these roads, so driving to the cities pretty easily. Let's build more housing outside of the city. Let's do that. So that's exactly what they did. They built a substantial initiative to create more housing outside the city. And how did it work? It worked great, right? Because they had all these roads that they had built out and parking lots and parking garages. Problem solved, right? So what was the result? Well, actually, again, it was successful. The average daily commute increased from 1957, from 4 kilometers, to 23 kilometers in 1975. So obviously this is very successful, right? But then, right, another problem comes up. At the same time, traffic-related deaths began to skyrocket from about 1,000 in 1950 to around 3,200 in 1972. And actually, of that, about 400 were children. So this, as you can imagine, created substantial social unrest. Because on the one hand, you've got drivers who are saying, look, you have to figure out what to do about making it better for cars. We have all these problems when we're driving. You need to fix those problems. But on the other hand, you've got the pedestrians and the people living in the city saying, no, the problem is the cars. You have to get rid of them. You have to figure out what to do with that. Like, that's the problem. And then all the while, you have, of course, deaths going up, traffic-related deaths going up. So this is quite the pickle, right? How do you solve this problem? Or I guess these multiple problems at this point. You can go the route of, again, either solving the car people or the bicycle people. So how did they solve this problem? Well, actually, they didn't. Instead, they opted for a solution. They put aside the traffic deaths. They put aside the problems with cars, and they put aside the complaints of the pedestrians. Instead, they asked themselves a question. What kind of cities do we want to live in? What kind of culture do we want to have? Do we want to be an automobile-centric culture? Or do we want to be a bicycle, pedestrian-centric culture? Now, I'm sure you all know which one they chose. They chose the latter. And so you can actually see the evolution here, right? Going from where cars are an afterthought here in the early 20th century to the 60s and 70s, where it's kind of evolved into this very car-centric, and then back to where closer we have now, where it's much more pedestrian and bike-friendly. So how do they do this, right? So again, after asking themselves what kind of solution we want to pursue, right? What kind of life we want to have, what kind of environment. Again, think back before, it's about environments. What kind of environment do we want to create and sustain for ourselves? They began making some changes. So first off, they didn't just make it difficult to own and use a car. They made it almost impossible. They actually took away roads. So they purposefully made this group of consumers, right, or citizens, they said, look, sorry, you might complain about losing all these things with driving a car, but sorry, we're pursuing this other vision instead. So they took away the cars or the streets for them. They took away the parking lots, took away all the parking garages. But that's not all they did, of course. They pursued other solutions as well. They thought, okay, let's create more bike lanes and widen the ones that we have. Remember those parking garages that we tore down? Well, let's put parks in there and encourage and restore those to city squares to encourage people to be more urban, to interact with each other. So again, they were pursuing this new solution, this new environment. So what were the results? After choosing to go into a new direction, traffic deaths began to plummet. And it's more dramatic than this, actually, because this is just absolute numbers. This is not taking into consideration population growth. So actually, the population was around 10 million in 1950, but then around 2010, it was around 16 million. So it's actually, if you did it per capita, it'd be much more dramatic than this. All right, so what's going on here? Well, I'm going to compare and contrast two ways of thinking about design, right, and dealing with systems. There's a problem-focused approach, or there's a solution-focused approach. So the first, to kind of visualize the difference. In the beginning, the government was taking a problem-focused approach to thinking about their systems, which is they have their system and they wait until there's some failure of it, and then they react to it. But as you can heard over time, what happens when you're dealing with a complex system, a problem might come up over here, and you think, okay, let's come up with a solution for that, and so you push that down, but then two more problems come up over here. Like, okay, well, let's solve those problems, but when you do that, 3 or 4 or 5 more problems come up over here. So you're constantly reacting to failures in the system, and every time you intervene, right, you create this ripple effect to disrupt other parts of the system. And that happens so often to where the system design kind of locks up and starts to fail. And that's what happened in 1972. Their system failed. However, when they were taking a solution-focused approach, they didn't wait until problems came up. They had a vision in their mind, and they just iterated through different ways of pursuing that vision, right? And they were proactive. So what are some characteristics of problem-focused versus solution-focused? First off, as I mentioned before, when you're problem-focused, you're being reactive, right? You're waiting for a problem to come up. When you're solution-focused, however, you're proactive, right? You're not waiting for a failure to come up or people to complain. You're just always making things better, right? You're just being proactive. Another characteristic is when you're problem-focused, you're always looking backwards. Again, think to the example with the Netherlands, right? The problems that you have today were created from the solutions that you adopted yesterday. So actually the problems that you have today are associated with the products and solutions that consumers adopted in the past. That's why I like to say, you can't create the products of tomorrow by focusing only on the needs of today. Because consumers' needs of today were created from the products that they adopted yesterday. Whereas again, for a solution-focused approach, and again, I'm talking about growth and innovation, right? This is not a quality thing. When you're solution-focused, it's always forwards-looking. You're trying to imagine, okay, what kind of new type of experiences can we create? And let's just test those and see if they work. And of course, quality versus innovation. A very classic way of thinking about it, I think, is if you're familiar with Six Sigma, which is it's a quality approach to improving things, improving a system, it was designed for manufacturing processes. So if you have an assembly line and making cars or whatever, you apply a Six Sigma approach. You systematically go through the assembly line, the manufacturing process, identify weaknesses or errors, and then iteratively go through and knock those out, right? And that helps you improve quality. However, doing Six Sigma on an assembly line of cars does not get you to a 3D printer. Because no amount of problem solving associated with a design or a paradigm or an environment, right, created as a result of an assembly line gets you to thinking to the 3D printer. Because the problems of assembly line are totally different from problems associated with 3D printing. So I'll give a kind of example here with some products. So kind of a somewhat history of mobile phones here. So the way I think about it is, the mobile phone, the early mobile phones, that was a new solution, right? And the early mobile phones, again, it's like the early adopters, they were not as good as the landlines that people were using, right? That was just a new way of thinking. However, once they had this idea, like, well, what if you could always answer your phone on the go? Like, yeah, I know it doesn't work now, but maybe sometime in the future, that's going to work out great. So they introduced this new solution, and then they problem solve, right, to improve it, right? So it's a quality play until you finally get probably the pinnacle of mobile phones, which is the Motorola Razr, which was tremendously popular. But then again, right, Black Rim comes along and thinks, okay, they weren't trying to improve. You don't really problem solve the Motorola Razr and end up with the BlackBerry, because BlackBerry, again, they were thinking about a new environment, a new experience. They were thinking, okay, how can we make email on the go just as good as emailing at your home office, right, or at the office, right, at your desktop computer. And yeah, maybe the talking part of it isn't as good as the Motorola Razr, but again, we're trying to pursue this new solution, new way of interacting. And of course, all the time they problem solve, then you get to the version of the more advanced version of BlackBerry. And of course, then we all know the iPhone thing. Again, you don't problem solve the BlackBerry and get to the iPhone. Because if you all remember, when the iPhone first came out, I know all my friends who had BlackBerries are like, oh, I can't email with that thing. That's ridiculous. Touch screen, no way. And then go back to their BlackBerry. I'll never leave my BlackBerry. And a few years later, they switched. That's because Apple was pursuing a new type of a solution, right? They weren't thinking, back here, they weren't thinking, okay, how can you have mobile phones on the go, or always have access to my phone wherever I am. They weren't thinking, okay, how can I have great email all the time? They were thinking, how can we give people the entire internet in their pocket wherever they go? So it's a new solution. All right, so for growth and innovation, some kind of do's and don'ts on this. So first off, don't focus on outcomes. Outcomes are the intermediary events associated with product use. Right, I interact with a product and it's going to create some specific outcome. Whereas, right, focus on the environments that consumers want to achieve and maintain. I think a good example is Gibson. There he is. What is the number one competitor to Netflix right now? That's pretty good. Is there another one? They said it in their Q1 Yep, Amazon Prime. A number of services, yes. Go back and check it out again. They say that we compete with, and I should have the exact quote, we compete with Fortnite more than HBO and Hulu and so on and so forth, right? So they feel like that they compete more with a video game than these other streaming services. And I think it's because, and actually it was so great to read that, because they thought about what they call screen experiences. They're like, look, we compete with other screen experiences. I don't think they said Facebook and Instagram, but that's probably what they alluded to that too. So again, because the outcomes of using Netflix, right, are going to produce a different set of outcomes for the consumer than Fortnite, right, or using Instagram. However, I think Netflix was really great in recognizing, look, we compete with these other ones because consumers are trying to create a certain environment of relaxing, or I had a rough day after work, or I want to zone out for a while. That's really the environment that consumers reach for. All right, and next, don't focus on problems, right? Because again, when you're focusing on problems, and I kind of want to put these in parentheses, right? This is for completely new initiatives. Problems are really the failures of an existing system. Whereas when you focus on solutions, right, you're aiming for a desired environment, and then you keep testing new solutions and seeing how can we get towards that new environment and what things do and don't work. And that's it. Thank you.